volunteered to give this talk when he was visiting his brother in Tulsa. So thank you very much for volunteering. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Livingston, since he's had such an interesting career. Dr. Livingston received a bachelor's and master's degree at the University of New Hampshire in chemistry and a doctorate at the University of Cincinnati. After that, he immediately went to the University of Chicago, and then shortly after that transferred to what was the Clinton Lab in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, now known as Oak Ridge National Laboratories. I believe the lab was brand new at that time, pretty much. He spent many years at Oak Ridge, and then in parallel with that was He's lectured all over the world, including Russia, France, Great Britain, Japan, and so forth, mostly in the field of NMR. And I wanted to say a couple more. Very active role in the civic affairs in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where he's been a member president of the Oak Ridge Symphony Orchestra and past member of the board of directors of the Oak Ridge Art Museum. He's also very active in his tennis club. So today, Dr. Livingston will be speaking to us on the makings of the atomic bomb, an eyewitness history of the Manhattan Project. Dr. Livingston.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is tell you of the scientific events that really got the ball rolling, so to speak, back in 1938, and what a rush there was in developing the scientific area that led to the eventual formation of the Manhattan Project and what took place in the Manhattan Project. The major scientific event was the discovery of nuclear fission. It stemmed from experiments done by Enrico Fermi in Rome. Fermi was simply irradiating with neutrons systematically the various elements of the periodic table and preparing radioisotopes of these elements. He found that if he used slow neutrons, that he got much more effective production in most cases of radioisotopes. But when he got to uranium, the situation became very complicated. And obviously a lot was going on that he did not understand. The study was taken up by Otto Hahn and colleagues in Berlin at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And these studies went on for a number of years. One of the close colleagues of Otto Hahn was Lisa Meitner. And if any of you are members of the American Physical Society, you would have received Physics Today, which comes out every month. And just in the September issue of this year, the front cover is Lisa Meitner, who co-discovered fission with Otto Hahn back in the 30s. It's a remarkable story about her, incidentally, an incredible story. But the fission was discovered by Otto Hahn and Lisa Meitner. It was published in January of 1939 in a German publication by Hahn and Strassmann. Lisa Meitner was conspicuous by her absence in the publication. And a matter of fact, she had fled earlier from Germany, running for her life because she was Jewish. And it was right at the reign of Hitler, the very year, in fact, that Hitler invaded Austria. When the news came out And partly the news came out through Lisa Meitner. She was in close touch not only with Otto Hahn, but with Niels Bohr. And I'm sure most of you have heard of Niels Bohr, Bohr atom, Bohr radio. And Bohr was eventually on his way to the United States in a rather dramatic style. And he carried the news of fission before it actually appeared in print. And when the American physics community heard of it, they couldn't restrain themselves in going to work on research. But it definitely was shown that a radiation of radium yielded a splitting of the uranium atom into major fragments. There was a question as to whether neutrons were also released, because if neutrons were released when the uranium fissioned, then there was the possibility of building a chain reacting system to have those neutrons recycled back, causing more uranium to fission. And as a matter of fact, Leo Szilard was in England at the time when he got the news of fission, and he immediately ran out and got a British patent on making a chain reacting system, which was then put under secrecy orders for the duration of the war in England. But he held a patent. Of course, Szilard soon came to the United States. The things that happened were in the research, just to outline some of the things, as you may know, natural uranium as it occurs is 0.7% uranium-235, and almost all of the rest of it is uranium-238. And research showed rather quickly that it was the uranium-235 that was providing the fission that was observed. The next major comment came, I believe it was from E.O. Lawrence from Berkeley, California, University of California, Berkeley, who pointed out that if you could separate uranium-235, you would have the basis of a new type of explosive that was completely beyond anything imagined previously. Another development was the realization that with uranium-238 present and neutrons present, well, the possibility of building a chain reacting system, and then with uranium-238 being there, that you could be making transuranium elements, in particular plutonium. The pathway is fairly direct to get plutonium. That element had only been discovered a year or two before by Glenn Seaborg, also at Berkeley, California. And it was realized that if you could get pure plutonium, that you'd have also the basis of a weapon. And that pretty much shook the community up. There was immediate publication of those results. After the first year, there is a journal called Reviews of Modern Physics. Usually it publishes the results of scientific observations some years after a field's been under development. The development during that period was so rapid that after 1 year, the Reviewers of Modern Physics put out a review on uranium fission and all the subsequent papers that came out. After that, silence. The physics community voluntarily decided to censor their work, that they would communicate with each other, but they would not publish. And before long, publishing couldn't be done anyway because of the relation to the war effort. Now, other very significant things that transpired was a contacting President Roosevelt to inform him of the serious nature of fission and what it could mean for the war effort. The contact was initiated by Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner in July of 1939. They were joined I believe by Edward Teller, and they met with Albert Einstein, whom they knew, and asked if he would help them prepare a letter that would be destined for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They felt with Einstein's stature and how well he was known, there was hope that they could actually get a letter to the president. A letter was prepared, and Szilard, Wigner, and Einstein met with Alexander Sachs in New York, who personally knew FDR, and told him the nature of the letter they wanted to get to the president. And with Sachs' help, they did get the news to President Roosevelt, who was very concerned about the situation. The letter pointed out that undoubtedly the German scientists were working in the same area, and whoever got the bomb first would probably win the war. Roosevelt formed a uranium committee under the National Defense Research Council, and a small amount of funding was made available. On today's standards, it was really a pittance. At that time, Enrico Fermi had come to the United States. Leo Szilard had come to the United States. They were working at Columbia University in New York to see if they could build a chain reacting system. I believe they got some of the small amount of funding to try to get pure uranium metal for their work, and also graphite, which served as a means for slowing neutrons down. This is referred to as a moderator. Incidentally, Wigner kept in close touch. He was a very close personal friend of Leo Szilard's. Things came to a head shortly afterwards, and President Roosevelt decided an all-out project was needed. And he decided that it would be placed with the Army Corps of Engineers, and that the funding would come through the military funding. I think that was a very wise political move, because if it were an independent agency, they would have to go to Congress to get money, and there would be no way that they could keep the project a secret. But by putting it in the Army Corps of Engineers, they could tap onto the very large sources of money that were made available to the military during the war without having to report the details to Congress. And that's what happened. Now, immediately, the Army Corps of Engineers established what was called the Manhattan District. It was established in August of 1942, and General Leslie R. Groves was named the military head of the Manhattan Project. His credentials: he's the general who was in charge of building the Pentagon in Washington as one of his earlier efforts. Already there was work going on in several sites, and I'll show you just a hand-drawn view graph that will more or less summarize the organization of the Manhattan Project through the Army Corps of Engineers. As pointed out, the Corps was established under General Groves in August of '42. The work was divided up, deciding to take both approaches: one, to separate uranium-235 to build a weapon. The other approach was to try to make plutonium to build a plutonium-based weapon. Work was going on at Columbia University in a laboratory called the SAM laboratory, a code name, Special Alloy Materials, under Harold Urey. It was a process of gaseous diffusion for the separation of uranium-235 through porous membranes. That work continued there to develop the process, and the plan then was to go to a production center, and indeed the production center selected was Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And the plan was then to build a gaseous diffusion plant in Oak Ridge to for preparing, separating uranium-235. The installation in Oak Ridge was known as the Clinton Engineer Works. As pointed out on the slide, the site was first examined in July of '42, and the first steps to acquire land was around September of '42. The area taken over was roughly 100 square miles, about 10 miles on the side. It was all rural area, all farmland. The Army told them how much they were going to give them for the land and said, "You've got 2 weeks to leave," and that was it. And immediately construction started, anticipating the gaseous diffusion plant moving in as a process for separating uranium isotopes. Another process was the an electromagnetic process. Really, it amounted to giant mass spectrometers that were developed at Berkeley under E.O. Lawrence. These large mass spectrometers were called calatrons, and the plan was to build an electromagnetic separation plant, also to go up in Oak Ridge, also to produce uranium-235. And an enormous sum of money was spent in developing those plants. Then the third operation was the plutonium project, and the plan was to centralize that at the University of Chicago, and the name given to the project there was the metallurgical laboratory. If there was ever a metallurgist there, I never found one. I might tell how I fit into the picture. I was a graduate student in Cincinnati, and I finished my degree in June of '43. In fact, in late May of '43. And I had obtained a job to go to the metallurgical laboratory to do research there. And I accepted the position. And as soon as I graduated, I went to Chicago and reported to what was called New Chemistry, which is a building that had just been put up as their chemistry lab. There were a lot of physicists working there that used university permanent buildings, Eckert and Ryerson halls on the university campus. And that was the research center for the plutonium project. Now, Enrico Fermi and Szilard were at Columbia trying to build a chain reacting system. They told them that they would have to go to Chicago to the metallurgical lab. That's where that kind of work was going to be done. They packed everything up in Columbia, the graphite, the uranium, Szilard, Fermi, and 3 or 4 nuclear physicists, and they all moved to Chicago to join the plutonium project. Now, as shown on the slide, the production for plutonium would be done first I should point out that the first chain reacting system was made on the University of Chicago campus by Fermi and his colleagues. And I do have a view graph of that first installation. There were no photographs taken at the startup of the first nuclear reactor. It was called the Chicago Pile. As you can see, it's a pile of graphite. There are holes in the graphite with uranium metal in the holes. By building it large enough, they were able to succeed to have it chain react, namely with a small neutron source to help it along. They would produce some fission in uranium, the uranium-235. The neutrons would enter the graphite structure and would be slowed down by making collisions with the carbon atoms, and they would make their way by diffusion to other uranium atoms, producing still more fission. By controlling the losses, namely by using very pure materials, and by making the structure very large to cut down the relative amount of surface losses, they found that they could achieve a chain reaction. And indeed, this is the startup of the world's first chain reacting system, what we call today a nuclear reactor. It was called the Chicago Pile at the time. In fact, they called it CP1, Chicago Pile number 1. 50 people were allowed there, incidentally, some of whom were working with Fermi. Others were invited to witness it. The measurements showed that they were going to go critical. It was getting large enough, and indeed, as they added more graphite and uranium to the system, it did start to chain react as they removed the control rods. The control rods simply were materials that absorb neutrons very strongly, and by removing them, the neutrons were free to diffuse through the structure and get a chain reaction going. The Chicago Pile went critical in December of 1942. That was about 6 months before I got up there. The reactor, you notice, is completely bare. There's no biological shield, so any radiation produced was free to go where it would. And that's one reason that the structure was never operated at very much power. The normal operating power for this first nuclear reactor was 5 watts. They did run it up as high as 200 watts during part of its lifetime to follow its response, and it controlled beautifully, and they were able to bring the power up to 200 watts. A person whom I knew very well was Ernie Wolin, who was in health physics at the time. He was there with survey equipment, and he was making measurements of the radiation, and in fact, at the time they ran it up to 200 watts, he was out on the sidewalk through that wall you're looking at to see how much radiation was out there on the sidewalk. This structure, incidentally, was in the west stands of Stagg Field. That's the athletic field at the University of Chicago. And it's underneath the stands. It was divided off in partition. And well, the structure did operate for a few months there. Then it was dismantled and sent to a site outside the city, out to a forest preserve that was owned by Cook County. Interesting enough, it was called the Argonne Forest, and some land was taken out there to reestablish this first pile and set it up out there. And it was very useful because for the development of new reactors, they could test the purity of the graphite by seeing if introducing the graphite into the structure caused a decline in the power level because of impurities in the graphite. So that's the world's first. Now, to get back to the plutonium project, as I pointed out, I showed up at the University of Chicago in June of 43, I might mention that, of course, everything was new to me there, and I reported to New Chemistry, where I was to work, and I was going to work in the radiation chemistry section under Milton Burton, and the secretary said, Dr. Burton is busy now, he's got a visitor, why don't you go into the lab and you'll meet a lot of the people you'll be working with, which is what I did. And I did meet several of the fellows, and they immediately told me everything going on. And I could just see that they just couldn't talk to anybody. There was such secrecy, and when they got a new man, they could unload. And the secretary poked her head in the door and said, Dr. Burton's free now, he'll see you. And as I got up to leave, they all said, don't tell Burton we told you anything. He wants the fun of telling you. And, so I went into Burton's office, and he told me what was going on. And he said the nuclear reactors being built, they were called piles then instead of a nuclear reactor, could be used for power production such as ship propulsion, or could be used for a weapon. And he says, we haven't been told which it is, but we're all pretty sure it's for a weapon. And of course, as the project went on, we all realized it indeed was a weapon that was being developed. The scale up was so great that at Chicago, they felt they could not go directly to production. Production reactors were going to be built at Hanford, Washington. But the scale up was too great, and they would need to have an intermediate pilot plant level. And Oak Ridge, Tennessee was selected as the site for the pilot plant. And the laboratory established there was called Clinton Laboratories, as you can see in the bottom part of the slide. And indeed, a pile was built there. During the war, one called it a pile. Today it's called a graphite reactor, to scale up the production of plutonium. The graphite pile in Oak Ridge produced 1 gram a day of plutonium. It was badly needed to do research, to study the chemistry, to work out the production techniques at Hanford, Washington. At first, they thought they might even build the production plants in Oak Ridge, but it was vetoed as being too close to Knoxville, Tennessee. There was a security problem. There also was a cooling problem. The power levels would be so high they would need great amounts of cooling, and Hanford, Washington was chosen next to the Columbia River, where they had adequate water for cooling the reactors that were built out there. Clinton Laboratories later became known as Oak Ridge National Laboratory after the war. The weapons research and the construction of weapons was done at Los Alamos in New Mexico. We use code names for everything. In Chicago, we referred to our site for the pilot plant as Site X. We referred to Los Alamos as Site Y, and Hanford, Washington was called Site W. And as much as possible, we did not use the actual geographic names of the places in case the conversation was overheard. Let's see. Let me try to get back in the order of things. The pilot plant was put up in Oak Ridge, and this is a modern view of the graphite pile in Oak Ridge. And it is there today. It has shielding, and so it can be run at higher power. And the typical power level was 3,000 kilowatts. And at that power level, the structure would make about 1 gram a day of plutonium. Now, the uranium metal was in the form of slugs that weighed a half a kilogram, a little more, a little over an inch in diameter, 4 or 5 inches long, and a plug would be pulled out of one of the loading holes, and I think I can get a clearer image if I do this. And with a ramrod, a whole row of slugs would be pushed in through this concrete face that you see, which is 7 feet of solid concrete in thickness as biological shielding, into the graphite core in back of that face. And when you wanted to remove the metal, with a ramrod, you continue to push until the string of slugs went out to the back of the graphite structure. They were enclosed in a plenum chamber with shielding, and the slugs would drop off the back end of that big cube of graphite, would fall into a funnel-like arrangement, and would tumble down to a canal at a lower level, and would be collected in buckets under 20 feet of water, and could be then moved to a processing building where the metal would be dissolved in nitric acid, and through chemical processing the plutonium would be removed for research purposes. This pile operated until the mid-60s. It was decided to close it down. There was very great fear at the laboratory that they would receive a lot of adverse publicity because it was one of the main reasons for being of the laboratory. And it was played politically very, very wisely. They made a very big celebration out of the shutdown, and they invited many dignitaries in. They invited the press and made quite a to-do about it. And indeed, it all went very smoothly. And this has been declared a National Historic Monument, and it's open to the public today. The reactor used air cooling, incidentally, and typically ran at 3,000 kilowatts. But during winter weather, you could run it up higher because the incoming air was cold, and you could have higher power level. So that's the pilot plant. Now, to go on further, I'll show a picture of a little bit of the wartime Clinton laboratories. The black building at the top here is the building that housed the graphite reactor. I show this because the wartime chemistry building is shown here, and I had my work area in that structure, which was the wartime wooden building put up for chemistry. Still another view of the laboratory area in later years shows the building containing the graphite reactor as this silver building. There are 2 stacks near it. One stack was the discharge of the cooling air that was drawn through the reactor. The other stack with the black top were off gases from the chemical processing operations, which were done in a canyon, a concrete canyon that doesn't show in this picture, but the off gases did go up that stack. And that is a somewhat later view of the laboratory. Now, the Clinton pile, incidentally, was started up on November 4th of 1943, a little less than 1 year after the first successful demonstration in Chicago of a chain reacting system. And believe me, that was a fast job, 11 months to design the structure. The physical design was done by Eugene Wigner and his staff doing calculations of the optimum lattice constants and spacings and amount of metal needed and so forth. And the construction contractor was the DuPont company for that graphite reactor. To mention other important dates, Trinity was the test of the first atomic bomb. Of course, that bomb was made with plutonium, and it was tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico. It was called the Trinity test, and it was a total success. It went off with an enormous bang. It fused the sand of the desert into a greenish-colored glass from the heat. In fact, shortly after, I was in Oak Ridge at that time, and I was at Chicago for 2 years, and then I transferred down to Oak Ridge. And I remember one of the fellows showed up from Los Alamos, and he had a vial with this greenish-colored glass in it. And he said, well, I picked it up at, the site of the Trinity test. And I said, gee, I'd like a chunk of that. He said, here, you can have it. So I have a vial of this greenish-colored glass in my desk at home from the Trinity test. Hiroshima, of course, came rather quickly after, on August 6th. And you probably know the story then. Now, there are a few comments I should make. The Hiroshima bomb was a uranium-235 bomb. And here's a view of it. If I can get this open. This is the uranium-235 bomb, and I do not know if this is a picture of the actual bomb that was dropped or whether it was the second one that was put in standby or what. But that is the uranium-235 bomb that raised such havoc with Hiroshima. Now, after the war, immediately after the war, Alvin Weinberg, whom I know very well in Oak Ridge, had a talk with General Groves. And Groves said that, he said, after Hiroshima, he said, I selected Nagasaki to be the second target, and I ordered that it be a plutonium bomb. And the reason, being a good military man, I think there's a vulgar expression the military use about saving yourself. It becomes very obvious when you look at the organization chart of the Manhattan Project, because the first bomb came from uranium-235 that used the output from both the gaseous diffusion plant, production of uranium-235, if I get coordinated correctly, and the electromagnetic plant. They actually used the output from both plants, thereby justifying the construction of those two plants to end the war. With the Nagasaki bomb being plutonium, one justifies the plutonium project. And the $2 billion then was regarded as well spent. General Groves was not the most popular man among the scientists, I have to tell you. I perhaps, if I overstate my time, perhaps I can give you an anecdote of why he tended to be not terribly popular. Well, perhaps a picture might help too of the of the Nagasaki bomb, the plutonium bomb, was called Fat Boy. And this is the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And it was referred to as Fat Boy. Now, during the early days in Chicago, before one had a reactor running, before you could get gram quantities of plutonium, the discovery of plutonium was done just by characterizing a new element from the radiation it emitted as a radioactive material. It's an alpha emitter. It has a 24,000-year half-life. That was how it was characterized. Now, eventually, one got to the point where you made enough plutonium under Seaborg's directions to see it. And what was done is they stacked uranium metal up at cyclotrons and left it there to be irradiated with neutrons over a long period of time. And then they would process that uranium to extract the little tiny bit of plutonium that was produced. And General Groves did visit our building while I was still in Chicago. I did not see him, but he was with Seaborg, and Seaborg took him down to the microchemist who had done the chemistry to get that visible amount of uranium-235. And Seaborg said, this is the world's supply of plutonium, 5 micrograms. It was about the size of a head of a pin. And of course, the microchemist who told me the story afterwards was proud, and Seaborg was proud. And General Groves said, let me know when you have kilograms. And he turned around and walked out. Not a very popular gesture. And it was the microchemist who told me what transpired while I was in Chicago. Anyway, let me go on and show what Oak Ridge is today. Here is Oak Ridge National Laboratory in a modern setting. 1996, the budget was $387 million. It's less today. Things have tightened up. Back then, we had less than 4,400 employees. The employment actually peaked out at about 5,000 people. At lunch, we were talking about the tandem Van de Graaff, and you probably recognize it here. It's a 20 million volt accelerator for accelerating positive ions. There's a cyclotron right next door to it. You can bend the beam and send it out through a cyclotron to really get very high energies. A great bit of the main research area is through these buildings. And in fact, my labs were in this particular wing, where I worked for a number of years. But that's the site pretty much of Oak Ridge National Laboratory today. Now, the Y12 plant is the area where one had the electromagnetic separation of uranium-235 with the calatrons. And the whole valley is just simply built up solid for about a mile with buildings containing calatrons and so forth. But also, there was some weapons work done there, building components for the weapon. Not the finished weapons, but building components with fissionable material, done at this Y12 area. And in fact, a year or two ago, I think it was the Ukraine wanted to get rid of a large quantity of plutonium, which was brought from the Ukraine after the USSR was dispersed. And the laboratory sent a large number of technicians over to look the plutonium over to be sure it was packaged properly for shipment. And it was shipped in, and it is stockpiled in this area today at the Y12 plant. They have major vaults there for keeping weapons-grade fissionable material under very tight control. And that material is at the Y-12 plant. The plant for gaseous diffusion separation of radioisotopes was commonly referred to during its heyday as the K-25 plant. This U-shaped building was built during the war, I'm pointing to, and at the time it was built, it was the largest building under one roof in the world. It covers acres of space, and it contained the cascades for separating uranium-235 from natural uranium, where one would go through a barrier plate and then the product would be pumped up and put into the next barrier, and so forth. The entire building is full of these barrier units. And other buildings were put up to enlarge the capacity of the plant that you see in this area in back here. And it's all closed down today. There's no longer production in Oak Ridge for separation of isotopes. This area today is now called the East Tennessee Technology Center, and the buildings now are being cleaned up, the equipment disposed of, and they're going to rent the space out to any industries that want to come into the area. But as you can see, in 1995, they had a $902 million budget, which is a lot of money, and they had 3,900 employees. That has gone way down. Life has gotten very hard. I think I'll just take questions at this point.
Thank you very much. I know there's a few students that have a class at 2 o'clock, so go ahead and, if you need to get to it, go ahead and leave. And Dr. Livingston has agreed to answer questions. So,
Is that first reactor still in existence?
The world's first? No. In fact, the west stands have been torn down.
Well, I know they moved, but
It went out to the Argonne site, but it's been dismantled. I used to go out there during the war. There was bus service from Chicago site out to the Argonne site, and we went out there to make irrigations, but not on the graphite. Interestingly enough, they built a reactor there using heavy water as the moderator. In fact, that's the approach the Germans were going to use. With uranium rods dipped into a tank of heavy water, and it was still called a pile, even though it was a tank of heavy water. It was called CP3. CP2 was the rebuilt graphite reactor, but they've been torn down, and the site is still under security control because it hasn't been completely cleaned up yet. But Argonne National Laboratory, which took a larger amount of land than they could have at that wartime site, kept the name Argonne National Laboratory after that wartime site, but it's been moved out to near Hinsdale, Illinois.
Ralph, tell about your story. You told me about top priority and pressure gauge.
Oh, well, when I was telling you about the priorities we had, well, I can tell you about, yes, how well the priorities were. I think I mentioned it at lunch, and I guess I forgot it, that I hadn't told it to this group. But during my research, I wanted a recording pressure gauge. Just a circular chart gauge, and the chart rotates once in 24 hours, and a stylus traces out the pressure. I wanted a 250 PSI, 24-hour chart. And I had the Ashcroft catalog, and Ashcroft is in Chicago. And so I just took the catalog number and told them I want Ashcroft number so-and-so, and asked procurement to get it for me. And it took about 2 weeks, and I got the gauge, and everything was fine. And the next day, the man from procurement called me up, and he said, "Did you get your pressure gauge?" And I says, oh yeah, it came in yesterday. He says, well, I had a lot of trouble getting that for you. And I says, how can that be? They make it right here in Chicago. He says, oh, he says, I went to Ashcroft and they were out of production. And I said, well, make one. And they said, well, it will take us 2 weeks to set up production to just make, even just to make one. And he decided, you know, the priority was absolute. And he decided he'd look elsewhere. And he says, you know how I got that for you? He says, I had him take it off a submarine that was being outfitted in New Orleans. and I had him send it up to you. And I thought, good Lord, what have I done to the war effort?
Are there any other questions?
Are these facilities all still being operated under the Department of Defense?
Oh, no, no. In fact, there was great lobbying by the scientific community to go civilian. And there were 2 acts in Congress. One was called the McMahon Act, which put everything under civilian control. The other was the May-Johnson bill, which put everything under the military. The military wanted the May-Johnson bill. The scientists and the civilians wanted the McMahon Act. It was the McMahon Act which passed Congress, and thereby was established what was called the Atomic Energy Commission, a 5-member commission. David Lilienthal, who was head of TVA, was named the first head of the commission. And Glenn Seaborg later became head of the commission, in fact, you know. But it's a civilian commission. And of course, it's evolved. It went through ERDA, the Energy Research and Development Authority, and then it became a department of the government. It's the Department of Energy today. But it went up civilian all the way after the war. I might point something else out that may interest you. I told you about the Szilard petitions, and I do have copies of a few of them here if anybody would like to look at the wartime petitions that ask that the first bomb not be dropped on the civilian population without warning, that it be dropped on a deserted island or at most on an island with a military base, that it be demonstrated first, and if the Japanese did not yield, then of course it would be used on civilian populations. The petitions did go up the line. They had to go on up through the military. They were secret at the time, and they did go up through the military to General Groves, who I'm sure was pretty disgusted with it all. But he had no choice but to bring them to his boss, who was Secretary of War Stimson during the war. And it is questionable that the president ever saw them. In fact, the last petitions that went up, Harry Truman was already at Potsdam, and that was just weeks before the dropping of the bomb. The petitions ended up in the National Archives, and they've been declassified. They're not secret anymore, and they've been fished out. And I had signed one in Chicago, and I had forgotten that I'd signed one in Oak Ridge after I got there. And a friend got a copy of the one that he signed and that I was on it as well, and he sent me a photocopy, and I pulled it out and looked at it, and there was my signature that hadn't changed a bit in 50 years. It was pretty obvious I'd signed it. And I have copies of those if you're interested in what they look like.
I was just wondering what kind of metal the screens of the gas diffusion reactors were made out of.
It's largely nickel. For uranium hexafluoride was the diffusion gas. And in fact, the contractor that is being paid an enormous sum to clean it up and get it out, part of his fee is to be able to put the nickel back on the market.
What are the actual dimensions for the bombs?
Oh, I can't answer that. I don't know. They were quite large. The payload was about the maximum the large bombers of the day could carry. The first one was called the Enola Gay, the second one was called the Boxcar, but it was a maximum load for the plane. So they were very substantial in size.
I think we'll stop with questions, but I'm sure that Dr. Livingston will remain around to take any more questions. And I'd again like to thank Dr. Livingston for speaking to us.